At the risk of suggesting that only pastors are called to something, I would like to share a little bit about my call story to become a pastor. We're all called. In our baptism, we are called to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. There are petitions that we recite when we are baptized. Friends, we are all called. But I would like to share a little bit about my call story. When I was 13, sitting in a basement floor in Omaha, Nebraska, it was the first time I thought I wanted to be a pastor. I had a phenomenal church growing up, what many would call today a progressive Lutheran church in Omaha, Nebraska. And I was determined and set that I would become a pastor all throughout high school. That's what people knew of me. And I went to college at an ELCA college in Nebraska, and I worked at a camp called Rainbow Trail Lutheran Camp. And in the midst of my deep conviction that I wanted to be a pastor, I started to see the hypocrisy in the politics that exist in church institutions. I won't go into too many details, but my college fired a beloved religion professor, political move. The camp that I worked at, my fourth summer, I was their program director, working 20 hours a day, as Drew was talking about his experience at camp, working 20 hours a day, and then the staff started having arguments and fighting, and I began to see, what? This church, we're supposed to love each other and get along and do good things, and these institutions are failing left and right. And so as a 23-year-old, I knew I wanted to go international. I knew that the most terrifying thing about becoming a pastor for me was preaching. Because how, as a 25-year-old, could I preach to a congregation with so little life experience? And so I wanted to go internationally and serve and live. And there's an amazing organization through our ELCA called the Young Adults in Global Ministry, where they send you different parts of the world to serve people doing work like health education, forestry, any number of things. It's kind of like Lutheran Peace Corps. So my two choices were Young Adults in Global Ministry or Peace Corps. And because I was so tired of the church, I chose the Peace Corps. I was running from the ELCA and from my call, and after a year-long application, which is typical for the Peace Corps, I was assigned, that's a key word, I was assigned to Senegal, West Africa, which is the country about the size of South Dakota, one of the poorest countries in the world. Subsistence farmers, herdsmen, herders, right? And I was assigned, once you get into the country, you get assigned to a village based on what your passions are, what your interests are, and your language. So I speak Wolof, still a little bit, and I lived in this village for 2 years. Chila Warhol was the name of the village I lived in for 2 years. And that village was 6 miles from 2 ELCA missionaries. Isn't God funny? While I was there, I was blown away by the differences between how we live in the US and how people who live in the developing world live. How many of you have been to the developing world? Like actually been where people live and not just tourist areas? It is a very, very different experience than being a tourist in a country. And Senegal doesn't have as much tourism. Brief example. In the village I lived in of 1,000 people, there were 3 spigots for water. And those spigots could get shut off because some leader of one village was mad at another one. That spigot was connected to a deep bore well that was dug by USAID. USAID. A year into my time there, a locust plague, I'm not even kidding, like you can't make this up, a locust plague came and decimated the crops of all the farmers in the region. I was out there with my village brother banging pots and pans as the locusts flew behind us and around us, settling right back on to their peanut and millet crops. No food that year. Who brought food to my village and to the surrounding villages? USAID. I have other Peace Corps volunteers. Since then, I've obviously moved on. I'm a pastor now. Several Peace Corps volunteers I know and have loved, who are colleagues, used to work for USAID. Friends, it's been a week for USAID, an amazing organization of our government that does exactly what I just told you. Make sure the poorest of the poor in the world have access to food and water, medical care. When you live in the developing world, you see the interplay and the beautiful ways that non-governmental organizations, governmental organizations, the faithful, like I said, there were Lutheran missionaries there were Japanese volunteers there, all trying to help the poorest of the poor and the neediest of the needy. So it was a rough week for me and my friends in the Peace Corps as we saw the decimation of USAID. Also this week, some of you may have read the really fun tweet or proclamation on X that you all are fake. You all are fake Lutherans. Did you all hear this? Sunday afternoon, if you didn't, Sunday afternoon we were accused as Lutherans of being fake, and that our organization called Lutheran Social Services, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, now called Global Refuge, are fake and they are money launderers. Please laugh at that. It is funny, but also very sad, right? Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, who for decades have helped people who have legally come into our country in desperate need of help in settling. Many of us know people who are immigrants and new to the country. It is not easy to resettle in a new place. Can I get an amen, right? It's not just leaving behind everything that you used to have. It's the culture shift. It's finding your way. Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services has been helping immigrants settle in this country for decades. Helping children who have been separated from their parents, who are at risk of being trafficked, find places to connect and be loved. And Lutheran Social Services, started by a group of clergy who felt the call to follow Jesus, and started that aid organization, which now helps place children who are in the foster care system, children who have been abandoned or been removed from their parents, to find loving homes. And it's not being a foster kid or being a foster family or adopting a child, especially a child that's been removed from their parents. It is not an easy, yay, here's my new parents and everything's fine. That's not how it works. Annie the musical is lovely, but it gets some things wrong. Instead, it takes years of therapy and help for children who are new and adopted into families to adjust. Those are the kinds of services that LSS provides. I tell you all these things about what's happening in the news because I think it's important. And I will say to you every time, every Sunday, I don't care who you voted for. But you are here in a Lutheran church, and we're real. And it is our task to speak the truth of Jesus Christ when the world around us is casting dispersions and lies and hurting the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, not just internationally, but right here. We're going to ground and root ourselves this morning in a powerful story of what it means to follow Jesus. I invite you to turn to your bulletin and open up, because this story is so full of promises and goodness. And it tells us the reality and the difficulty of following Jesus. So in the story of Jesus' life, right, he has just been, he's been baptized, he has been tempted in the desert, and he's just himself at this point. But people are following him because he's a healer and he's a teacher and he's profound. And he's standing on the shore of the sea, and he's so crowded in that he asks one of the fishermen, turns out to be Simon Peter, He says, hey, can you row me out a little bit so people can hear me? And he sits on the boat and he preaches and he teaches. Simon Peter, bless his heart, had been working all night. As a committed and gifted fisherman, he knew the best fish were at night. But he's exhausted because he caught nothing, and neither did his crew or the other fishermen around him. So Jesus finishes preaching and he turns to Simon Peter and he says to him, go, cast your net in the deep water. Try a new thing, a new idea. And Peter sighs. The sigh of a man who has worked hard, pulling and hauling. The sigh of a man who knows how to fish and knows that fish do not like the deep water and the heat of the morning. And so Peter voices his skepticism. He says, Master, we have worked all night and caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets. In the middle of Peter's two sentences is a reality that I wonder if any of you can relate to today or you have in your past. Have you ever worked so very hard at something only to be disappointed? Worked hard to be a good person or a good citizen, to put good in the world, only to find that it's wrecked in a moment? And that phrase, yet if you say so, I will let down the nets, right in the middle, is a space that Debbie Thomas says is the space between weariness and hope, defeat and faith. This is what is contained in Peter's response to Jesus. Master, we have worked all night, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets. That's a pretty incredible act, to take that leap of faith. If you say so, I will follow you and follow your call for me to care for the hungry and the hurting, to stand up for what you have asked me to do, whether in the workplace or on the playground, in our families. If you say so, I will trust that something greater is out there in the deep. If you say so, I will come and follow. And so Peter takes the leap of faith, verses 7 through 9. And indeed, there was fish, so many fish that they had to signal, right? You don't want to yell because you'll scare the fish away. They had to signal. Other boats, come together. Bring in others. More people were involved, quietly gathering to do the work. Part of our call as people is to quietly gather and to keep doing the work. Jesus does not call us to follow him alone. And the community of fishermen haul the fish ashore, and it is such an abundance of food, which would have been a bounty in a time of scarcity and heavy taxation on fish from the Roman government. It would have been a bounty to feed families for weeks. This is part of the gift of following Jesus. When we stick together and work together in our leaps of faith, there is an abundance. And what is Peter's response to this miracle? When the fish are hauled ashore, it says that Peter prostrates himself on the ground. And he's terrified. He's ashamed. How do you imagine you would respond when faced with an awe-inspiring moment like seeing Jesus? How might you respond if you got a glimpse of the vast goodness of God? Peter feels unworthy, perhaps thinking, how could the Son of God want me on his team? Do any of you relate to that? How many of you have ever said to yourself when someone asked you to do something or be a part of something, how many of you have ever thought, oh, I'm not good enough, I'm not bold enough, I'm too busy, I'm too old, I'm too weary? And Jesus responds to Peter's question in verse 10. Don't be afraid. This is the other reality of following Jesus. When we follow Jesus, it removes fear. Because following Jesus is about love and not fear. Sure, Jesus has moments of frustration where he gets a little bit stern, but he says quite often to people, do not be afraid. And why is it important that Jesus wants us to love him and not fear him? Because fear controls us, it subdues us. Fear makes some of us flee and makes some of us freeze. But fear has a temporary effect. Fear can turn us in on ourselves and say, watch out, preserve your own life and well-being and interest. But again, it's temporary. But love, when we do things out of love, when we act out of love, it casts out fear. But love liberates us to act out our own creative forces and abilities. Jesus calls us in love to follow him. And that love is so overwhelming to the fishermen that what do? They leave that haul of fish behind and they follow Jesus. But I'm skipping a really important phrase in verse 10. Jesus says, do not be afraid. You will catch people. Catch. Greek word, zogreo. Zoe, life, zoology. Jesus says, if you follow me, I will help you bring people to life. A life of freedom, true liberation from the existential dread that is in each of us. Friends, following Jesus and his teachings, his ways, is an invitation to a flourishing life. Yes, a flourishing life no matter our external circumstances. Because following Jesus has the ability to guide us on how to respond to life situations. Following Jesus grounds us in the cosmic, never-ending love of God. Again, to some, following Jesus casts out fear. It calls us to flourishing. Following Jesus gives us power through the Holy Spirit to do more together than we thought possible. This is how God and Jesus work in the world. In our reading from Corinthians, it's Paul writing to the church in Corinth. Paul is so humble, explaining to the readers about the beauty and the grandiosity of following Christ. But also reminding the people who are reading that letter that he's not worthy. Because he was a persecutor of Jesus. But he says, I was someone who persecuted folks, but because of God's grace, I'm here. Because of God's grace, I am here teaching and preaching and healing, working hard, spreading the word of Jesus, sharing his teachings. Again, it's because of grace, not fear or threat, that Paul is doing what he's doing. Grace is our superfuel in this calling that we all have. Again, we are all called. Grace is our superfuel. And in those moments like Peter, when you think, oh my gosh, I can't do this. Yet if you say so, Master, I will let my nets down. Friends, we are called to be in the deep water. We are called to follow Jesus. No matter how we feel or how much life is overwhelming, remember this call story. Our words from our hymn today echo very much of what I've said. I invite you to stand as you are able and sing this hymn together.